Well, it's either here or outside in the Jeep with no top.
A little rain won't hurt me.
Well, it hasn't done you any good either.
Oh, come on, Pam. This is like check.
Somewhere in the back of a deteriorating storage facility, behind rows of forgotten inventory and beneath a layer of dust thick enough to write your name in, there were boxes. Plain, unmarked, unremarkable boxes. The kind you'd walk right past without a second thought. They had been sitting there for decades. No security. No special climate control, no indication whatsoever that what was inside them would shake the music world to its core. But when those boxes were finally pried open, and the old magnetic tape reels inside were carefully, almost nervously, threaded into a machine for the first time in half a century, what came through the speakers stopped everyone in the room cold. It was Elvis. Not the Elvis of greatest hits compilations and Hollywood montages, not the Elvis frozen in cultural amber, forever young in a gold lamb jacket or forever tragic in a white jumpsuit. This was something else entirely, something that sounded like it had been buried on purpose. The recordings weren't scraps. That's the first thing people need to understand. This wasn't some dusty bin of half-finished demos or garbled rehearsal chatter that only a die-hard collector could love. What surfaced included complete vocal takes, full band arrangements that had never appeared on any album, and intimate, unpolished studio moments that captured the man behind the myth in a way no official release ever had. The sheer volume of material was staggering, but even more unsettling was the quality and the obvious, deliberate care that had gone into recording it. Someone had engineered these sessions properly. Someone had labeled the reels with dates and song titles. And then someone had made sure the world never heard a single second of it. That's the question that hung over everything once the discovery became known. Not just what is this, but who hid it, and why? Because these tapes didn't end up in a random storage unit by accident. They were moved. They were separated from Elvis's official RCA catalog at some point during or shortly after his lifetime. And they were placed somewhere that had no logical connection to Graceland, to the estate, or to any of the official vaults where posthumous material had been carefully curated and parceled out to fans over the years. Somebody made a choice. Somebody decided these recordings didn't belong with the rest. And if you know anything about how Elvis Presley worked in the studio, you know that lost material from him isn't just plausible, it's almost mathematically guaranteed. Elvis was relentless behind the microphone. He would cut take after take after take, sometimes 30 or 40 versions of a single song, adjusting phrasing, experimenting with tempo, pushing his voice into places that made seasoned session musicians put down their instruments and just listen. For every track that made it onto a record, there were dozens that didn't. The official explanation was always simple: those were just working takes, raw material, nothing worth releasing. But the people who were actually in those studios told a very different story. They talked about performances that were transcendent, versions that were better than what ended up on the album, emotional deliveries so intense that the engineers would look at each other through the glass and silently mouth, "Are you getting this?" So where did all of that go? For 50 years, that question floated around the edges of Elvis scholarship like a ghost nobody could quite pin down. And now, with these tapes finally surfacing, the answer was starting to take shape, and it wasn't comfortable. Because among the recordings buried between alternate arrangements and unreleased songs, there were moments that captured an Elvis almost nobody alive has ever truly heard. Stripped of every layer of production and persona, his voice carried a weight on these tapes that even people close to him weren't fully prepared for. Priscilla, according to those in her circle, found certain tracks almost unbearable to sit through, not because they were painful to hear musically, but because they were too honest. Too close to the man she knew when nobody else was watching. But to understand why these tapes threatened to rewrite the Elvis Presley story from the ground up, you have to go back to the years when the people closest to him were fighting to control the one thing he refused to surrender: his voice. There's a version of the Elvis Presley story that most people know by heart. The poor kid from Tupelo who walked into Sun Studio and changed the sound of American music overnight. The handsome rebel who scandalized television, conquered Hollywood, sold more records than anyone thought possible, and then slowly, tragically, lost himself somewhere between the medication and the entourage and the golden cage of Graceland. It's a clean narrative. Rise, reign, fall. And almost every word of it is incomplete, because it leaves out the war that was happening behind closed doors for the better part of 2 decades. A war over who actually controlled what Elvis Presley was allowed to create. Colonel Tom Parker didn't manage Elvis the way a normal manager handles a client. He owned him. Not in the metaphorical sense that music journalists like to throw around, but in a contractual, financial, almost suffocating sense that left Elvis with shockingly little say over the most fundamental decisions of his own career. Parker decided which movies Elvis would make. Parker decided which songs would go on which albums. Parker blocked international touring for years, reportedly because his own undocumented immigration status meant he couldn't risk leaving the country. And when it came to the studio, the one place where Elvis felt most alive, most himself, most free, Parker's influence seeped in like a slow poison, shaping not just what got released, but what was even attempted in the first place. Elvis knew it. He hated it. And every once in a while, he fought back in the only language he truly trusted, the music itself. In 1968, Parker wanted the NBC television special to be a safe, friendly, commercial-friendly Christmas concert. Smiling Elvis. Harmless Elvis. Elvis as America's well-behaved son. Instead, what the world got was one of the most raw and electrifying performances in the history of televised music. Elvis in black leather, sweating under the lights, playing with a ferocity that made it clear he wasn't asking permission anymore. The comeback special didn't just revive his career, it was a declaration of creative independence that sent shockwaves through his inner circle, because for the first time in years, the public saw the artist Parker had been keeping on a leash. Then came the American Sound Studio sessions in Memphis, early 1969. Elvis, operating with more creative freedom than he'd had in years, walked into Chips Moman's studio and recorded like a man trying to outrun his own legacy. The sessions produced Suspicious Minds and In the Ghetto, 2 of the most emotionally complex and commercially successful recordings of his entire career. But what most fans don't realize is how much material from those sessions never made it out the door. Engineers and musicians who were present have spoken about it in interviews over the years, carefully, sometimes reluctantly, describing takes and full performances that were boxed up, shipped out, and never spoken of again, not because they weren't good enough. Because they were too different, too far from the formula that was making everyone around Elvis very, very wealthy. This is what people in the industry quietly refer to as vault politics, the unspoken practice of shelving recordings not because they lack quality, but because they don't serve the commercial narrative being built around an artist. With Elvis, this wasn't occasional, it was systematic. Entire sessions were buried because the material didn't fit the mold. Too bluesy, too gospel-heavy, too emotionally exposed for the mainstream packaging Parker demanded. The result was a catalog that, while staggering in its breadth, represented only a carefully filtered fraction of what Elvis actually created. And the cost of that filtration was a man slowly drowning in frustration. Elvis surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, while the one thing he actually wanted, control over his own artistic voice, remained permanently out of reach. The pills got worse, the isolation deepened, the performances became more erratic, more desperate, more haunted by the gap between who he was on stage and who he was allowed to be on record. And so the tapes sat. Through the death, through the mourning, through decades of carefully managed posthumous releases that gave fans just enough to stay devoted, but never the whole truth. Because somewhere out there, in a place nobody thought to look, there was more. So much more. When the first recovered recordings were finally played back in proper studio conditions, cleaned up just enough to cut through the decades of magnetic decay, what came through the monitors wasn't just music. It was a confrontation. Every polished radio-ready version of Elvis Presley that the world had memorized for half a century suddenly felt like a photograph taken from too far away. Technically accurate, but missing everything that mattered up close. Because on these tapes, there was no distance. There was no buffer between the listener and the man. and that closeness changed everything. The material itself covered a wider range than anyone anticipated. There were complete alternate takes of songs fans thought they knew by heart, recorded with entirely different arrangements that revealed creative choices Elvis had fought for and lost. Tracks that had been released as polished, heavily produced singles existed here in stripped-down acoustic form. Just Elvis at the piano, working through a melody with a patience and vulnerability that the commercial versions had been deliberately engineered to hide. And then there were the moments between the music. Elvis talking to his musicians in a voice that carried none of the bravado the public expected, laughing at a missed chord, humming something under his breath that didn't match any known song in his catalog, pausing mid-take, saying nothing for a few seconds, and then starting again with a delivery so emotionally different from the previous attempt that it sounded like a completely different human being had stepped up to the microphone. Vocal coaches and music critics who gained access to portions of the material described the experience in terms that went far beyond technical admiration. One well-known vocal analyst said publicly that listening to these tapes was like hearing Elvis breathe for the first time, that the released catalog, as extraordinary as it was, had always presented his voice through a filter of commercial expectation, and these recordings removed that filter entirely. What remained was an instrument of almost terrifying emotional range, capable of shifting from gentle intimacy to devastating power within a single phrase in ways that the official discography only ever hinted at. The reaction from fans was immediate and overwhelming. Online communities dedicated to Elvis, some of which had been running quietly for 20 years with the same small group of devoted members, suddenly exploded with new activity. Posts poured in from around the world. People shared stories of sitting in their cars unable to move after hearing leaked audio clips. Grown men and women, some of them grandchildren of original Elvis fans who had grown up hearing their grandparents talk about the King with a reverence they never quite understood, posted tearful videos saying that for the first time in their lives, they finally got it. They finally heard what their families had been trying to explain for decades. But not everyone welcomed the discovery with open arms. The Elvis Presley estate moved quickly to assert legal ownership over the material, and representatives made public statements expressing concern about the release of recordings that Elvis himself may never have intended for public consumption. Some family members echoed that discomfort privately, suggesting that there was something invasive about letting the world hear moments that were captured in the sacred privacy of a recording studio. Moments that were never mixed, never mastered, never approved. It was a reasonable position, and it landed in the middle of a fan community that was in no mood to hear it. Because for many listeners, the counter-argument was devastatingly simple. Elvis always wanted to be heard. It wasn't the artist who locked these recordings away, it was everyone around him. Music historians weighed in with a different kind of urgency. These tapes, they argued, weren't just lost songs. They were missing chapters in the creative biography of one of the most important figures in 20th century culture. They filled gaps in the timeline that scholars had debated for decades, providing concrete evidence of artistic ambitions far more sophisticated and emotionally adventurous than the mainstream Elvis narrative had ever acknowledged. But here's the part nobody was prepared for. The most shocking thing on those tapes wasn't a song. It wasn't a vocal performance or an unreleased masterpiece. It was a single moment captured accidentally between takes that fundamentally altered how even the people closest to Elvis understood who he really was when he thought nobody was listening. It was barely 30 seconds long, tucked at the tail end of a reel dated from the mid-1970s, well past the point where the session had officially wrapped. The tape kept rolling, and what it captured was never meant to be heard by anyone. The musicians had packed up, the engineers had likely stepped away from the console, and Elvis, apparently alone in the live room, began talking. Not to anyone in particular, maybe to himself, maybe to God, maybe just into the empty air of a studio that had heard him give everything he had for hours and still wanted more. His voice was quiet, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. He spoke about feeling like the music was the only part of his life that still made sense, that everything outside the studio walls, the people, the obligations, the weight of being who the world needed him to be, felt like wearing a costume he couldn't take off. And then, mid-sentence, he stopped talking and started humming something. It wasn't a melody anyone has been able to identify. It didn't match any known recording, any published composition, any documented session from that period. It was just Elvis alone with a melody that belonged to no one but him, drifting through it like a man finding his way home in the dark. People who have heard that moment, and as of now, very few have, describe it as the single most revealing 30 seconds in the entire Elvis Presley archive. Not because of what he said exactly, but because of what his voice sounded like saying it. There was no performance in it, no charm, no stage presence. For the first time in perhaps the most extensively documented career in music history, there was absolutely nothing between Elvis Presley and whoever was listening. And what came through in that nakedness wasn't the tragedy that tabloids had been selling for decades. It was clarity. A man who understood his own situation with painful precision, who knew exactly what was being taken from him and exactly what he had left, and who turned to the only honest thing in his life, the sound of his own voice in an empty room to hold himself together for one more night. That moment reframes everything. For 50 years, the dominant Elvis narrative has been split down the middle like a broken record. On one side, the worshippers, fans who elevated him to something almost divine, untouchable, beyond the mess of ordinary human life. On the other side, the tragedy merchants, the documentaries and tell-all books that reduced him to a cautionary tale about fame and excess and self-destruction. Both versions contain truth. Neither one is complete. And what these recordings offer, perhaps for the first time, is the third version. The private artist. The man who used music not as a product or a performance, but as a survival mechanism, the way some people use prayer or confession or the quiet act of writing in a journal that no one else will ever read. There is a profound irony in the fact that the most authentic Elvis Presley content to ever reach the public is content he never intended to release. The polished albums were brilliant, but they were negotiations between Elvis and his producers, between art and commerce, between the man and the myth. These tapes carry no such compromise. They are the unedited, unmanaged, uncontrolled truth of who he was when the machinery of fame wasn't watching. And for a new generation of listeners discovering Elvis not through oldies radio or Halloween costumes, but through raw, unfiltered clips surfacing online, this version of the King feels more real, more urgent, and more heartbreaking than anything a greatest hits collection could ever deliver. Those dusty boxes in that forgotten storage facility held more than magnetic tape. They held the final chapter of a story the world thought it had finished reading decades ago. The king of rock and roll, silent for half a century, still had one last gift. Not a hit single, not a comeback, but something far more valuable. The truth of his own voice, unguarded and aching and completely, irreversibly human. Elvis once said he didn't know anything about music. All he knew was that he felt it. These tapes prove he wasn't being humble. He was being honest. And now, finally, the rest of us get to feel it too. If this story stayed with you, do one thing for me, hit subscribe so you're here when the next one drops. And leave a comment telling me the one Elvis song that still stops you in your tracks no matter how many times you've heard it. I read every single one.